Welcome to today's web briefing. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to the release of the New Jersey Nonprofit Diversity Report. I'm Linda Zippo, President and CEO of the Center for Nonprofits, and I'm very excited and proud to present today's session. Joining me behind the virtual curtain is Caitlin Giles McCormick, the Center's Program Coordinator and a Principal Researcher on the project. We have a lot to cover today, but we are recording the briefing and you will receive a link to the recording along with the slides and other follow-up information via email. If you have any questions or technical difficulties, please enter your question into the chat box. Feel free to ask any substantive questions at any time and we'll address them in real time if we're able. If time permits, after the conclusion of the formal briefing, we'll open the audio lines for some brief questions or discussion. If we can't get to a question this morning, we will be sure to follow up afterward. The Center for Nonprofits is New Jersey's state association for the nonprofit community. Since 1982, the center has existed to strengthen New Jersey's nonprofits individually and collectively in order to improve the quality of life for the people of our state. If your organization is a member of the center, we thank you for your support and involvement as we pursue this work together. If you're not a member, we invite you to join us and experience firsthand how membership can work for you. We have a lot to cover today. We will be going over several different things. We'll start with a little bit of background behind the nonprofit community and this project in particular. We'll review some of the key survey findings. We'll hear some reactions and observations from our presenters on the line. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the action steps that nonprofits can take to continue the journey to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in our communities and beyond. We know that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and this is just building on a lot of tremendous work being done by others, and this is just one step in a much, much longer journey. So we'll talk about what comes next and look forward to continuing this conversation and to work alongside you. Today, in addition to myself, we'll be hearing from Jeff Key, member of the Center's board, consultant at Infinity Enterprises, and our Diversity and Equity Committee co-chair. We'll also hear from Sean Thomas-Breitfeld, co-director of the Building Movement Project. Some of you may remember that Sean was a keynote speaker at our annual conference a couple of years ago. We'll hear from Coltrane Stansberry, manager of Diversity and Inclusion and Volunteerism at PSEG, and we'll also get a message from Keith Timko, another Diversity and Equity Committee member. He is the Executive Director and CEO of the Support Center and a former Center board member. So let me start by turning things over to Jeff to talk a little bit about some background and from the board perspective and from his other work.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Linda. Welcome to everyone who is able to join us this morning to find out more about the high-level findings of this report, but also to kick off this very important discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion, what it really means for the future and the strength of the New Jersey nonprofit sector moving forward. So I want to start off my remarks by offering a little bit of insight about this project and the work we hope to do moving forward from the board perspective. So I have the honor and the privilege of being one of the co-chairs for Diversity and Equity Committee that's been formed for the Center for Nonprofits board, along with our board chair, Gina Platino. And I think the formation of that committee is the result of ongoing discussions and a recognition by the Center's board that this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for the broader sector, but also is at the heart and really touches a lot of the other strategic work and priorities that we hope to accomplish over the next couple of years. So one thing that the center is definitely looking forward to, this report being the first step in that direction, is really serving as a convener, facilitator, thought partner to help organizations and nonprofits across the state be able to have conversations about this issue, share best practices, and really start to make progress. As we discuss the high-level findings of our report later, they match up with some other research that's been done, indicating that nonprofits, in a theoretical sense, are recognizing that diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to be a priority, but having a lag in some of the progress that's achieved, because these can be, I think, conversations to have, and some organizations really struggle with even starting that process. So later on, we're going to be sharing some resources and hopefully connecting and making people aware of a lot of leading organizations that are doing groundbreaking work in this area, as a strong first place for your board to find how to get started on this journey. So jumping to the high level findings of the report, and providing an overview of that before we touch on them in more detail. One of the things that we wanted to highlight in the report is the connection between some of the findings and issues of race and racial equity in the sector, whether that's at the board level, looking at staff makeup, looking at access to opportunities and pathways to leadership. But the report also starts a discussion on touching on intersectionality. So certainly looking at racial equity as a primary finding, but then also considering how gender, age, a whole host of other dimensions of diversity are also really important if our nonprofits are going to make progress. And having boards that are representative of the communities we serve. And seeing how this issue is really connected to fundraise, and looking at the impact that your programs and services on the communities that you serve. So we really see this internally as a priority for our work here at the center, but also something that is vital for the continued growth, credibility, viability of the New Jersey nonprofit sector as a whole. And so at the end of the day, I think we're looking at really trying to drive forward some key outcomes. I think first among them is giving boards some confidence, motivation, engagement to really lead the way on having open, honest, productive discussions about these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many times boards are determining the strategic direction and priorities of the organization. So we feel the more confidence and initiative they're able to display in this area, it will help to push things along and also engage community members, staff members, and making this a priority, and hopefully having New Jersey be a model in making progress in this area. That's really, really important to serving all of our missions. So at the end of the day, we see diversity, equity, and inclusion not as something that needs to be considered separately. As a separate priority, it really does play a core role in many of the other challenges that nonprofits are facing and trying to address. And we hope that continue dialogue, work, training in this area is equitable and inclusive, and is really covering the needs of everyone who is in a position to some additional details about the findings, sharing some resources and best practices. So with that, I will turn things back over to Linda to share some information about the high-level findings that we saw from the report.
Thank you, Jeff. And as Jeff mentioned, there are a lot of themes that will come up time and time again as we review the findings and the implications for the nonprofit community and how we can all move forward individually and collectively. This is something that we like to start a lot of presentations with as a reminder of how important nonprofits are to a thriving communities, strong societies, a strong, in our case, New Jersey. We talk a lot, of course, when people think about nonprofits, about the vital programs and services that nonprofits provide, but nonprofits are also a vital part of the economic engine. So we've got 34,000 501c3 organizations in the state of New Jersey. employing 10% of the workforce and spending more than $42 billion annually with 1.5 million plus volunteers. So the point here is that nonprofits are vital to the economic engine of the state. And when we're talking about good, thriving organizations, we're talking about diversity and equity and inclusion. This is all interconnected. So if we want to have a thriving communities, it's all related. Again, this is something that everybody has been talking about for quite some time. As Jeff mentioned, there is a disconnect between talk and action, or good intentions and the next steps. But for those who may not have been looking at this more recently, so some reminders are important. Obviously, we have a long history of systemic societal bias and particularly racial bias in this country and in the state of New Jersey. We know that the population will be shifting, and that has already happened. There is a huge difference between the average age of white Americans and the average age of Americans of color. And if we are going to model good behavior, but more importantly, if we're going to succeed, and if we're going to represent and reflect our communities, and if we're going to have good pipelines to leadership, we need to pay attention to all of this. Beyond that, we certainly believe that as nonprofits, as mission-driven organizations, nonprofits have an imperative to advance a just society. And this all relates back, again, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, among many other things. But there's also plenty of data that shows that diverse boardrooms, diverse staffs, diverse leaderships, and really modeling the best possible practices here improves outcomes. There's plenty of data in the for-profit world that shows that more diverse entities are more successful financially, programmatically, and otherwise. And the same would be true for the nonprofit community. And as Jeff said, this is interconnected. It's not something that is an ancillary kind of discussion or examination. If we want to succeed as organizations, and we're serious about pursuing our missions, we cannot ignore the realities and the connections between diversity and good outcomes. Of course, there's been a lot of really, really important work that has gone on across the country about diversity and equity, or the lack thereof, in nonprofits, starting with the Race to Lead report from Building Movement Project. And we're so thrilled that Sean Thomas-Breitfeld can join us on this call, and we'll be hearing from him in a little bit. But there was groundbreaking work there that shows just how stark the divisions are in this community. Board Source, Leading with Intent, has tracked the diversity of boards for a number of years at this point. Koya Partners, The Governance Gap, is a great report that really brings in stark terms the disconnect between composition of boards in nonprofits. So these are really important. These, among many others, are really important work being done on the national level. But we wanted to explore the extent to which this is going on in New Jersey. We like to think in New Jersey, first of all, we're nonprofits, we're forward thinking, we're progressive, we are mission driven, and we're doing we're doing everything right. We often like to think that in the nonprofit world. We also think, of course, in New Jersey, with one of the most diverse populations in the country, that this couldn't possibly be an issue here, or we're perhaps farther along than other states. So these are some assumptions that it might be natural for somebody to make. So we wanted to take a look at the extent to which diversity gaps or gaps in representation are an issue here. So what we did, Center for Nonprofits conducted a comprehensive salary, benefits, and diversity survey. We very deliberately combined all of this. We wanted to make sure that we were getting the best, most comprehensive information that we could. This is a survey that we conducted late in 2018. So we asked about compensation, we asked about demographic information about board and staff, and then we spent a lot of time looking through this information and analyzing it for the kinds of trends that might show what the state of diversity is in the nonprofit community. So the findings in this report are based on the 204 responses that we received from organizations, but we do think there's a lot here that we can there's enough information here that is pretty telling and in some cases pretty disturbing. In short, we do have a problem here in New Jersey nonprofits in terms of diversity representation gaps in leadership. And our findings, our key findings, major findings, come under several key themes. First, again, this is very consistent with what we've seen in national studies. People of color are underrepresented in both board and staff leadership positions when you compare this with the overall makeup of staff in the organizations that we surveyed. Second, organizations that primarily serve communities of color are significantly more diverse racially and ethnically than those that don't. We did find notable gaps in compensation in leadership positions when comparing by race as well as gender. And when we controlled for things like budget size, size of organization, experience, educational attainment, these things were still factors. And last, to the point that Jeff was making before, organizations in our survey were not prioritizing in terms of their governing documents and similar kinds of policies. We were not finding that our respondents were prioritizing diversity by memorializing them in some of these key documents and organizational guidance. So the first thing is, the first finding, of course, is that people of color are underrepresented in boards and in leadership of nonprofits. On both the CEO level and the board level, 79% of CEOs in our survey and 79% of board members in the responding organizations are white. 64% of overall nonprofit staff are white. So you can see the disconnect between having employees seeing themselves represented among the leadership. And of course, this all has other implications for the success of organizations being able to recruit and onboard and develop new talent and retain new talent, because there's certainly there's plenty of data out there, disturbing data showing that people of color are not staying in organizations. So that's clearly a big concern. As I mentioned before, CEOs of color are especially underrepresented in nonprofits that don't primarily serve communities of color. You can see on the chart for organizations that primarily serve communities of color, 67%, 2/3 of the CEOs are white, compared to 90% of CEOs that are white in organizations that don't report that they primarily serve communities of color. We also saw that the overall racial and ethnic staff makeup and diversity of the staff tends to be greater in organizations that primarily serve communities of color. And we also did some analysis of compensation based on race, and we controlled for other factors like the budget size of the organization and whatnot. And for 3 out of the 4 top executive positions in nonprofits, there was definitely a gap between the compensation of white people in that position versus people of color. And there's still a persistent gender gap in terms of CEO compensation in nonprofits. In our survey, female CEOs earned on average 22% less than their male counterparts. And that is something that's, again, not unique to nonprofits. It's not new, but it is something that we saw in this survey as well and continue to track. We also asked about policies and how nonprofits are trying to attain or advance diversity and equity in their board policies. Nearly half of our respondents don't have anything in their bylaws that specifically address issues of diversity. There is a sizable component that has a general values statement, but only small percentages of our respondents require specific levels of representation or other more specific goals to advance diversity. And so there's not a lot of indication among in our survey that there are concrete metrics being put into place and accountabilities to track. Another thing, this is shifting gears a little bit, the Center for Nonprofits conducts an annual issues and trends survey. We gauge funding trends, we gauge concerns, and just taking a pulse of the nonprofit community. And as part of that survey, we ask respondents, what are some of your top issues and concerns that are, identify your top 5 that are affecting either your organization or the nonprofit community as a whole. And we provide a list of a couple of dozen issues. In terms of our survey, you'll see that there's a little bit of a contrast between the number of respondents who identified advancing diversity and equity in the nonprofit community overall as one of their top 5. About a quarter of our respondents identified that as a top 5 concern. Meanwhile, 14% of our respondents identified that as a concern for one of their top 5 for their particular organizations. And just to put this in perspective, the concerns and issues that tend to rise to the top among our top 5 usually has to do with finances and financial sustainability and financial uncertainty. It has to do with needing and wanting to strengthen the board. It has to do with other kinds of funding issues and also visibility and marketing and communications and the ability of organizations to get their messaging out and the ability to afford and retain good qualified staff. So if you think about, and we're going to get into this some more, and I'm going to turn things over to Jeff again in just a moment. But as you think about this, as you think about the top concerns, boards, financial strength, visibility, messaging, outreach, these are all things that are obviously strengthened in an organization that has a diverse board and a diverse staff and is practicing, modeling good practices in furthering diversity, inclusion, and equity. To Jeff's point, this is not something that should be considered as an ancillary or side concern. It is integrally related to absolutely everything else. So I'll stop there and I will invite Jeff to come back in with some more observations.
Great, thank you, Linda. So this next slide has some key figures that we pulled from the latest version of the Board Source Leading with Intent survey. And at the end of that survey, they share some overall results of their responses that they got when they surveyed organizations. And I think there were a couple areas that had noticeable gaps between maybe a board's recognition of the importance of certain areas and then some of the responses about zeroing in on finding out whether boards had taken kind of concrete steps to implement policies or take action to make progress in certain areas. I think most notably, there was a pretty large gap in some of the figures that are featured here, as well as fundraising. And so if you kind of take a look at the figures that are outlined on this slide, on the one hand, you have a fairly high percentage of boards kind of recognizing the importance of diversity as it pertains to their mission pretty explicitly. So in an abstract sense, they understand that kind of this is important in support of our mission. And on the right-hand side, you see kind of a notable drop-off in the percentage of boards who responded to this latest version of the survey, who were able to answer affirmatively that they've been able to implement some concrete steps, make progress, take kind of action moving forward to either measure certain metrics around diversity, inclusive diversity, inclusion, and equity, or had been able to do training and dedicate resources on the forefront of some of the work that they were doing moving forward. And some of my work over the past couple years has been working with the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network, both here in New Jersey, but also in a national sense, and having a lot of very kind of pointed discussions with folks who are emerging nonprofit leaders in the sector. And I can, certainly say with confidence that some of your next generation of really talented nonprofit professionals are looking very closely at what their organizations are doing and what other organizations are doing to really take steps to make progress in this area when they're making decisions about what type of organization would I like to work for, or where do I see myself moving to, or what type of organization would be attractive for me to work at. I think also on a broader note, many of you may be aware that GuideStar and Foundation come into information and data that they're collecting about whether or not boards have kind of certain policies and procedures in place around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think increasingly, if you haven't seen it yet, you certainly will. More funders, when you are applying for grants or when they are doing reporting and trying to get a sense of the impact your organization is having, they're asking very pointed questions, and they want to see that organizations are kind of making a demonstrated commitment and have some things in place to address these issues and show that they're taking them seriously and trying to make progress. So we think that, with New Jersey nonprofits being such a vital part of the state's economy and providing such important services and programs to communities throughout the state. And I think past couple of years in the Issue and Trend Survey, the demand for those services and programs is only increasing, that this view of diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important for boards to have and to incorporate into their strategic planning moving forward, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because it's going to help you have greater impact and definitely be something that can commit your organization to having a stronger profile moving forward, whether that's with the community, whether that's with volunteers, whether that's with donors who may be able to support you in the work that you're doing. So I think with that, it looks like we are going to transition over and introduce Sean Thomas-Breitfeld from Building Movement Project.
Great. Hello, everyone. I want to start by congratulating the Center for Nonprofits on their leadership in doing this important research. I'm really grateful to be here and happy to support the release of this important report. And I also look forward to, and I think to some extent encourage other state associations around the country to follow the lead of the Center for Nonprofits by incorporating a greater and more intentional focus on diversity into the research that's being done in state and local nonprofit sectors. So I want to use my time to highlight some of the places where the findings from this report really intersect with the research that we did at the Building Movement Project as we were building and developing our Race to Lead initiative. And I also want to acknowledge and I think congratulate the center for helping to also move the conversation forward. Because I think that all of us are learners in this race equity journey that we're on as a sector. And so it's important to be asking new and different questions so that we're continually moving the dial. So in terms of the points of intersection, I think that one thing was just the articulation of the moral and ethical imperative of nonprofit organizations to both advance a just society and then foster equity within our organizations as equitable workplaces. I thought that was really clearly put out, and it's been such a key part of what animates for my organization, the Building Movement Project, our initiative around race and leadership in the nonprofit sector. And I think that it's sort of this North Star that we have to continually be focused on is the alignment between what our organizations advocate for publicly and how our organizations operate internally, and making sure that those things are in alignment. And there were a whole bunch of observations about the data that I think were clear points of overlap with the findings from the Race to Lead survey and the various reports that we've put out over the last few years. I thought it was useful to again show the way in which leaders of color are particularly underrepresented in nonprofits that are not, as a core part of their focus, serving communities of color. It was a very clear parallel to findings from the report that we most recently put out on executive directors and CEOs of color in the sector earlier this year. And in addition to the data and the observation about where people of color as executive leaders are concentrated in the sector, I think that it raises a question for all of us to consider as a sector about not just that people of color are being concentrated and possibly relegated to a particular part of the sector, but how can we start flipping the framing of that inquiry to think about what it would take as a sector and why the sector isn't investing more in the organizations where people of color are currently leading. Because our research found that organizations that are focused on POC and immigrant communities tend to have smaller budgets. Those executive leaders have more stress and anxiety about being able to raise funding to carry out their organizational missions. And so if as a nonprofit sector, we're committed to supporting the leadership of people of color, then I think that that means also supporting the organizations that those people are currently leading. I think we need to also be focused on diversifying other parts of the sector, but it's also critical to be investing in organizations where leaders of color currently are. And those organizations are ones that are doing critical work in our communities and often are more financially insecure because of lack of access to resources. Also connecting to the point about intersectionality, the research and the data that you all found about that 22% gap in the income for executive directors and CEOs based on gender really paralleled a lot of what we ended up focusing on in the Women of Color report that BMP released at the beginning of this calendar year. And I think for our research, we have the added finding that there were both issues of gender around pay across race, right? So in general, men in executive leadership roles were being paid more highly than women in executive leadership roles. And there was also the finding that women of color were expressing more challenge and frustration around the low salaries of everybody else. And so, I think that raises questions around both assumptions, but also who has the sort of wherewithal and ability to accept a lower salary. And then what are the assumptions in the nonprofit sector about why people should not be paid more equitably or more fairly for the leadership work that they're contributing to the sector and to their communities. And it was also interesting to see some of the similar data points around education, not necessarily evening the playing field. And particularly, I think for the research that we did through Race to Lead, observing that when you looked at both gender and race, that men and white people seem to get a bigger income boost from earning advanced degrees than women of color. And so I think that brings up questions around both access to higher and advanced degrees, but also the cost and the student loan debt that many of us end up taking on to pursue those higher degrees that make us oftentimes better and more equipped leaders for the challenge of nonprofit executive leadership. So I want to shift to acknowledging and highlighting some of the ways that the report added some new insights that I think as a nonprofit sector, we really should be investigating. So the Building Movement Project has not delved much into the board dynamics because we've relied on our partners at BoardSource to really carry the water on board diversity. And I think it was really interesting to see some of the parallels between the Center for Nonprofits report and the BoardSource data. Certainly encouraging that in the New Jersey data, there's a greater degree of board diversity than the data from the national level. And I think it might be worth considering what are the ways to support documentation and highlighting of what it took for organizations in the state of New Jersey to have both more diverse boards, but also boards that are inclusive, where people of color, people from the community, people with lived experience can actually be a part of sharing and building power with other board members who may come from more traditional backgrounds of having wealth and white privilege that they are leveraging on behalf of the organizations that they're supporting. But so might be an opportunity for New Jersey to help lead the way for other organizations around the country to understand what it actually takes to both build, but also then sustain more diverse and inclusive boards. I also thought that in the question and sort of interrogation of organizational bylaws was really helpful because it points us as a sector to a very clear and tangible action step that more organizations across the country can be pursuing and also can be pushed to consider. Because I think we've gotten to a point as a nonprofit sector where if an organization has decided they're going to do some kind of initiative or learning objective around diversity, equity, inclusion, oftentimes a starting point as well, has the organization incorporated a commitment to diversity and equity into the organization's mission statement? Is that reflected in the job postings that the organization poses? And those become sort of useful sort of go-to interventions for organizations. I think we need to be thinking also about the kind of interventions like a bylaws change that has clear structural impact on organizations. And that's the sort of intervention that I think it's really useful to be pushing organizations and the sector more broadly to start considering. So just to wrap up, I want to give a little bit of a sense of what's sort of on the horizon for us and what some, I think some recommendations are for nonprofits more broadly. So, I think that as already pointed out, this question around the bylaws is something that I think more organizations should really be considering and digging into. And then it's also useful to be able to share case stories, case examples of what happens when those questions get surfaced in organizations, what it takes for leaders to helpfully facilitate that kind of dialogue and organizational change that leads to structural shifts in how the organization's leadership is structured and who's in those kinds of positions. We know that these change initiatives can take time, but they also require real leadership and they require peer-to-peer sharing of insights because, what we need to do is build more of a sense that this has to be the new norm in the sectors that organizations are going to be, organizational leaders in particular, are going to be pushing the envelope and pushing these conversations about equity inside of our nonprofit organizations. And so an invitation to organizations in New Jersey, part of what Building Movement Project is trying to do as we move forward, it's not just to, we have a ton of data from the survey that we just completed this summer, so the next version of the Rates to Lead survey, and we'll be putting out reports on that data starting in 2020. But we're also trying to build an organizational assessment, and so are looking for organizational cohorts and partners who are willing to help be pilot testers of a tool that helps organizations identify where they are on a range of current capacities and competencies around diversity, equity, inclusion, and then identify some next steps. So next steps like the bylaws change and other things that can actually help organizations in a really concrete way move towards becoming more equitable workplaces, more equitable organizations, and to the larger ultimate point, organizations that can bring about more equity in the communities that they're serving. So again, thank you so much for having me be a part of this rollout of this important research. And I want to, again, thank the Center for Nonprofits for leading the way in incorporating a really clear focus on diversity into the research that you're doing on the nonprofits in your state. It's really important work, and I think it's going to take all of us to keep moving this conversation. So thank you very much.
Sean, thank you so much for your leadership. The work that Building Movement Project has done has been groundbreaking and really trend-setting and very important. It helped to inspire us to engage in not only this project, but it really has been helping to drive home the challenges that we face. And again, I cannot thank you and your colleagues at Building Movement Project enough for everything that you have done, and look forward to supporting and learning from you as we move ahead. Next, I'd like to invite Coltrane Stansberry from PSEG to talk about some of the work that PSEG has been doing in terms of championing and practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion at PSEG, along with some recommendations to share with us. Coltrane?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Linda. I appreciate the introduction. We at PSEG, we're in an interesting part of our journey in diversity, inclusion, and equity, in that we, like most Fortune 500 companies, are trying to address what are our business needs of the future, and how do we create the future workforce, giving the impact of different environmental and market pressures that give us this opportunity to rethink and reimagine ourselves, especially with the backdrop of climate change and what it means to be a new energy company of the future, and what are the competencies that our workforce will have to have, and what are the opportunities for diversity, inclusion, and equity to inform that conversation, and in some instances expedite that journey and create priorities around areas of opportunity. Next slide. So what we've done is we created this sort of first step for ourselves in this part of our journey, which is to really reaffirm our commitment to diversity and inclusion and equity by making sure that we show up internally and externally on core commitments that we can hold ourselves accountable toward. One of those is the CEO Action Committee that we commit to be a part of, which is a roundtable of CEOs that commit to D&I. And it clearly states in sort of the 4 core commitments that have rolled out over the last couple of years to really embed our CEO, Ralph Izzo, in a conversation with other leaders around how to practice D&I and equity in a space where there's some level of visibility to what we're doing, accountability, as I mentioned earlier, but then also where we can continue to sort of be a part of the ongoing conversation and dialogue around how to be sensitive to communities of care. And so in that commitment, we have a commitment to making sure, number one, that we're really convening a type of conversation about D&I, and that translates into everything from how we do fireside chats, roundtable discussions, senior leadership engaging our day-to-day employees, and making sure that there's visibility and rise to voice in our employees on the conversation. Second, that we're implementing unconscious bias education, which we rolled out this year and committed on a scorecard goal for D&I to train 500 of our employees and D&I leaders, including our D&I council members and members of our employee resource groups. I'm actually leading an engagement to train the remaining 200 of those employees on this coming Monday in 2 sites throughout our footprint. And then thirdly, we share our best practices. We want to make sure that we are being transparent about what's working and what's not working. And the best way to do that is to make sure that we are publishing where we are currently in terms of representation, and that we're being honest with ourselves about how to get there, the pathway forward. Lastly, that we're also creating an accountability system for tracking and measuring progress. And for us at PSEG, that means making sure that the D&I group doesn't just foot the full responsibility of this work, but that we're partnering with HR, we're also partnering with corporate communication, and with our lines of businesses to make sure that all of our D&I goals are being met, and that the scorecard that we've created around D&I, that there is responsibility and that there are an aggregate way of measuring our progress through all of our leaders and stakeholders in this space. Next slide. So that led us to, to really look at our core commitments and really break those down in several areas and buckets that we can really start working on. And part of that is looking at our commitment, top left, to adopting sort of broad ways of, we stated it earlier in the last slide, broad ways of having a decision-making process that is inclusive of all of our leaders, but also creates feedback for our employees. We also want to make sure that we're looking at our talent pipeline and that we're incorporating diversity in those decision-making processes. So how we're looking at how we're defining high potential employees, how we are moving the needle on gender and also people of color, and then also how we're looking at defining opportunities for those individuals in particular to advance, or if not, have increased responsibility on their journey toward promotion. Also, making sure that we have a vehicle for measuring progress. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a scorecard for D&I, making sure that that scorecard is linked to compensation, but also that there's accountability on the goals and objectives of each individual senior leader and leader of and people manager for D&I, specifically on advancing talent, but then also on showing up in leadership opportunities to lead things like EBRGs, as well as sitting on diversity and inclusion councils and participating and promoting D&I events internally and externally. We also are looking at the ability to create better and more visible ERGs. As you all know, employee resource groups can be a very great resource to propagating D&I goals, but they can also be, if we're not careful, just another layer of employees that can create a sort of bureaucracy, and if we're not careful, it can stagnate the conversation to have not the right voices in the room that are willing to be inclusive and propagate inclusion throughout the organization. And so what we plan to do in 2020 is really reinvigorate our ERGs, making sure that we are taking the right inventory, that there's consolidation. They're not three, for instance, women ERGs, but that we can consolidate and create synergy around our footprint, and make sure that we've got the right mix of folks that are representative of those groups, and that we can create some equity in terms of how our ERGs are resourced, and that they have the right access in terms of senior leadership. Next. This slide really shows how we view our community of care, so to speak, internally, and what the strategic drivers are of D&I within our organization, and how we sort of gauge and manage the performance of our system at PSEG. Our organization that D&I sits in is within what we can call our corporate citizenship and culture group, which includes not only D&I, but our citizenship and our foundation side, which is how we sort of give, obviously, to the communities where we live and work. But then this third wheel is also our government affairs group, which is state and federal government affairs. So they're owned in a very unique space. A lot of D&I and equity organizations sit within HR. So we want to make sure as we build out, as you see this diagram, that we are building strong relationships within corporate citizenship and culture, that we're talking and sharing with each other between government affairs, our foundation in corporate giving, as well as our D&I group, and that we're sharing specifically partnerships and finding ways where we can cross-functionally manage a partnership with, for instance, a United Way or a March of Dimes, and find opportunities within volunteerism, within the way we co-market and brand with those NGOs, and also opportunities to give as well. And that we're managing those partnerships strategically in ways that make sense for our employees, but also for the NGO and the community itself, which means taking a very good look at our calendar to see where there's opportunities for us to market around days that matter to all of our organizations. So within that, citizenship and our reputation, we talked a little bit about that, how we co-brand and market together. Inclusion and purpose-driven culture. Culture is a major component of what we want to make sure we're focused on for the future, and where there may not be opportunities, especially in a utility, to immediately hire because of collective bargaining and because of sort of the collective sort of captive opportunities that exist to manage and lead an employee base with very, very specific job roles. We know hiring is not necessarily going to be our opportunity. It's going to be in how we promote and how we sort of propagate a great culture to retain talent over time. And lastly, looking at leadership and workforce representation, being very intentional around how we address, for instance, gender equality around pay and promotion around people of color, and also looking at this third opportunity, which is retaining talent and moving talent that's been here for only 5 years and under. Being mindful that that group of folks that are here only 5 years are not always young people. They're also seasoned vets that we can't afford to lose, getting talent from other organizations and helping and sharing best practices from groups that help us grow. So that's really sort of comprehensively how we consider to be opportunities to advance the D&I and equity mission at PSCG. We want to make sure that we're constantly being mindful that, as stated earlier in all the presentations, that the footprint of our company has to change and grow with how the demographics of the state and the demographics nationally are changing and growing, and making sure that we move the needle and not just base ourselves on how utilities grow and advance, which is often very conservative compared to the market in general, but that we're being sensitive that we're in a hyper market, being in the New York metropolitan area that is in many ways progressed and is very dynamic compared to the rest of the country in terms of hiring needs, folks being very concerned about career advancement, and being very sensitive about living and quality of life in our market. So we're trying to make sure that diversity, inclusion, and equity help address some of those needs and help position us to be not just a utility company, but a preferred employer in this region. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that excellent overview of some of the work that PSE&G is doing on this front. I know they've been a long-time supporter of the center's work, and one of the things that I think we want to highlight as we look forward to next steps from this report moving forward is that many of our board members and folks who engage with our nonprofits are from the corporate sector or work for-profit businesses, and there's a lot of opportunity there as they look at this issue from their point of view to find ways to partner in alignment with the work that we're doing on the nonprofit front. So we did want to highlight as we move forward towards kind of covering what's next following the release of this report and steps that organizations can start taking to drive this forward. And so some high-level bullet points on things that boards can look at. Again, noting that a lot of times they're setting the strategic decision. People at the organization, whether that's the CEO and staff, volunteers, many times board members are ambassadors. They're having a lot of contact with folks. In many ways, they can be the face of the organization, thinking about what they can do. So being able to take a step back and have open discussions about your organization's culture. Having a willingness to embrace and invest in diversity and equity in terms of your staff representation, volunteer representation, board representation, and making sure that your programming is achieving equitable and inclusive outcomes for the communities that you serve. Having strategic investment, measurement, and accountability around this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Looking at what tends to get prioritized in organizations, things that are measured and that you are tracking progress on. And there are steps to doing that, but I think a first step is really just to commit to having measurement and accountability that's appropriate for wherever your organization is in this process. We spoke a little bit and covered, looking at your organizational policies, bylaws. I know organizations will periodically review their bylaws. Sometimes there is a stretch of time where they haven't been revisited. And so I think, as you're going through that process, being able to certainly look at fundamental things that may need to be updated, but also looking at it through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and saying, are we able to adjust, include policies that are going to help us make progress in this area. Another point that I think is very important, board members being ambassadors, faces of the organization, being able to lead with the values. So a lot of times board members are very aware of what the strategic priorities of a nonprofit are, whether that's capital campaign, whether that's their signature event, whether that's programming initiatives. And I think it's very powerful for board members also to have clarity on the organization's focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, to be able to speak to that and model that as they engage with the community. Budgetary and resource priorities. So again, going back to that leading with intent report and some of the findings there, your budgets, I think, necessarily reflect values and priorities. So we all know that there are challenges for nonprofits around resources and revenue and making sure that you have what you need to be able to carry forth your mission. But I think as we've kind of mentioned on this web briefing, diversity and inclusion isn't necessarily separate from other priorities. So that resources that you might devote to that isn't necessarily taking away from other things that you could invest in. It can, if you're approaching it strategically, help you enhance and reach a lot of your other goals and your overall organizational success. And then looking at CEO hiring and oversight. So I know that there was talk of the assessment, hiring, kind of relationship between the board and the CEO, whether that's a hiring process or the support for, I think, certainly CEOs and leaders of color as they enter into those positions, really being able to assess what your board dynamic is in that regard as well. So there are, I think, a couple first steps that organizations can look to take in starting to progress in this area. And so I think very fundamentally, begin having those conversations. This can be a topic that does bring up challenging, complex, intimidating conversations. But I think without having those conversations, it's going to be very hard for your organization to make progress. And so that may be something that you're willing to do internally. There are certainly facilitators that you can bring in to do that work. I think it's critically important to just have that open dialogue. And in connection with the next point, sharing data with your board and staff. Another first fundamental step might be, if you have this information, that's terrific. That's a great place to start. But if it's not something that you've measured in the past, just being able to figure out where your organization currently is going to help inform that conversation, certainly at your board level, and be strategic about what are the priorities and gaps that we see at our organization that we need to address. Shortly, we're going to be sharing information about some of the resources that have been mentioned, which are fabulous, and will help, I think, give boards a very clear framework if they're unsure about how do we move forward, what are some of the first steps that we can take. And from the perspective of the board, this report is certainly a first step towards continued work in this area, to be able to share best practices and highlight some of the things that organizations can do moving forward. Looking at your board and staff recruitment, retention, and onboarding, and other practices for bias. And that can, again, similar to bylaws, just be something that has been the same over time because of inertia, or that's kind of the way you've always done things. And so some of the gaps that we see are due to unconscious bias. And so I think these conversations help bring that out, and kind of pairing that with knowing how you can improve those policies, put new practices into place to really make progress and narrow those gaps is very important. Broadening your outreach and connections. And so I think boards and people in general, our networks tend to reflect our own personal background to a certain extent. And so really being able to take a step back during your recruitment and hiring processes to say, you know, are we reaching out to new and diverse groups to find talent, to find high quality prospective board members that could help us make progress in this area? And not only on the representation front, but really get diversity of thought that's going to help your organization address complex problems that nonprofits are facing. Looking to establish a leadership pipeline for professionals of color. So again, you have folks who are at organizations or looking to join organizations who have an immense amount of talent, new ideas to bring, and being able to attract and retain those folks really requires organizations to have thought through, you know, is our access to opportunities in the way that we're looking to develop and advance folks inclusive and equitable for our everybody who is involved with our organization. And then I think definitely worth noting is that this process isn't a one-time effort. It's a continuous dialogue, a continuous commitment, and a willingness to change, and I think experience some discomfort initially, but looking forward to realize that on the other side of having those conversations and making some of those changes is hopefully ability of your organization to fulfill your mission more effectively and be a stronger organization as a whole moving forward. And I think that's certainly a goal for boards to take into account as they try and prepare organizations for success looking forward. So with that, we are going to shift and share a video featuring Keith Timko from the Support Center, who's been doing some of this work with the Center for Nonprofits, is also one of our diversity and equity committee members. He's going to be speaking and sharing some information about some of the resources that are featured in the report and that are available to organizations who want to start doing this work.
Gotta press play at the bottom.
As part of the committee with the Center for Nonprofits on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, myself, Keith Timko, and Yvette Murray wanted to share a few of the resources that we think might be helpful for folks who've read the survey results from the Center for Nonprofits and want to do something about it. So If you're not familiar, I would check out BoardSource that runs a biannual Leading with Intent survey around diversity and in some ways equity practices at the board level, at the staff level. Certainly the Building Movement Project is a great resource with their Race to Lead study. Also would want to call attention to racialequitytools.org, which has a whole series of tools, resources, sample assessments, making the case. And then places like Center for Nonprofits, and that become those places where we can talk to one another, can talk to other groups. And so what we found is asking people about how are they addressing diversity, equity, inclusion in terms of HR practices, annual staff surveys, looking at disaggregating data. And so just asking the question, are people being paid more or less based on gender, race, educational attainment? So just talking to one another, asking one another those questions, sharing practices. And then I think another untapped resource is also reaching out to people who may work within the corporate sphere in human resource management or human capital management, and asking them what practices are they seeing, whether it's compensation, employee retention, recruitment, onboarding. How are they tracking and measuring their results? I think that's an untapped place where folks might think about recruiting someone like that.
I do apologize. I understand we had issues with the video. The good news is we do have those resources reproduced elsewhere in the report and on this presentation. So we will definitely connect you to that, but we do thank Keith for bringing those to this presentation, and we'll share all of that with you. We are nearing the end of the presentation, and we sorry about that, a couple technical difficulties, but we are back on track. We're reaching the end of the webinar and the briefing, but I did want to call attention to a couple of other members of our Diversity and Equity Committee. Sandra Toussaint, a member of our board from the United Way of Greater Mercer, and Allison Howe, Executive Director of Volunteer Connect. Both of those organizations and many others are very committed to advancing diversity and equity in nonprofits throughout the region and throughout the state. So stay tuned for more information about what they are doing. Volunteer Connect helps to connect organizations with board members, and since we talked about the fact that this all starts with the board, that's a very key. Stay tuned about what they're doing, but we're very, very grateful for their involvement as well as the rest of our committee. I did want to mention, if you have not heard, the Center for Nonprofits annual conference is going to take place on December 4th. It will be held in Somerset, New Jersey at the Palace at Somerset Park. Space is still available. There will be 600 people talking about key issues affecting the nonprofit community, and there will be discussions about advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We will have breakout sessions devoted to how do we have these difficult conversations in order to progress beyond the good intentions onto meaningful change within our organizations. There are some scholarships available thanks to our sponsors, so there should be no impediment to everybody to come. So please check out the information about the conference, and we look forward to continuing the conversations there. By way of reminder, the report will be sent to each of you, and it will also be on our website. And we do want to thank a number of funders for supporting the center's work in this regard and this report in particular, including the FM Kirby Foundation. The Support Center has provided important support, PSEG, the Fund for New Jersey, Dodge, to name just a few. We're also very, very grateful to our board, our Diversity and Equity Committee, to Caitlin Giles McCormick, principal researcher on this entire project, and to everyone who took the time to complete this survey, because this is the information that enables us to learn more and to drive the information forward and to drive the process forward and really to pursue real change. These are just a few of the resources that were mentioned on the video and are mentioned in the report, but more to the point, we have set up a web page on the Center for Nonprofits site at njnonprofits.org, and this is going to be an organic page. We want to grow it. We want to make sure that you can find or contribute information to drive this forward, because we're all learning, we're all in this together. There are a number of great organizations and leaders that have been doing tremendous work and leading the charge, and we are grateful for the opportunity to learn and support them. But there are others who are maybe just beginning this journey, so we want to create a space where organizations can access information and tools and educational opportunities, again, recognizing that so much really important work is already happening. But if you have resources that you would like to suggest, if you have resources that you'd like to see, please send them to us so that we can advance this conversation and make this keep this journey going together. We do hope that you'll keep in touch with the Center for Nonprofits by way of our email list and our social media feeds. And we hope, again, we want to thank everybody who took the time to present today, Jeff Key, Sean Thomas-Breitfeld, Coltrane Stansberry, Keith Timko, and all of you for joining us today. This is just one part of the Center's commitment to advancing diversity and equity and inclusion in nonprofits and to strengthening leadership pathways in nonprofits for women and communities of color. So we look forward to hearing your insights and keeping this work going together. Thank you very much and look forward to staying in touch.